So the first question is a broad and general one. So how how did you decide? How did you choose, and if you chose at all, to become a writer yourself?
Wow. Okay. You're right. That is quite a broad one.
Yes, it is.
So, um, let's see. I don't think there was a single moment, a single sort of choice point where I thought, okay, I'm now, um, uh, yes, okay, I have decided what I want to do with my life is. I can sort of look back through and see um, that it was a path that I just sort of slowly found myself on. I remember I always used to be very keen on telling stories. Um, I loved creating stories in my head. And when I was a little kid, I would actually act them out, running around the backyard with a piece of wood that would be a laser gun or a sword or a whatever. When I got older and I started to write things down, I do remember that even from my early years at school, um, story writing, which we called, composition or creative writing or whatever at school, was uh, something I always really enjoyed. It turned out to be something I was always really good at. If I say so myself, I got good comments and good feedback from it.
Mhm.
I started to notice that when we got given a writing assignment, the other kids in the class would be going, "Oh, they didn't like that," and I'll be going, "Great! This doesn't even feel like work. This is lots of fun." And I started getting I got particular encouragement from my teachers. Who there was one particular when I was in fifth grade, so I would have been 10 or 11, who actually got in a special pack of sort of story prompt cards, and when the he would give out a story writing assignment to the class, and then I would get a special one because he wanted to wanted to encourage me. So by that stage, I was starting to think of writing stories as this thing that I was good at. Um, you had some kids who were good at sports, and there were some kids who did music, and that was their thing. And my thing seemed to be more and more writing stories. At what point should I sort of stop and let you do the feed the translations? By the way, what's the sort of the
Oh no,
rhythm with
you
this?
can tell everything you want. I'm just taking notes, and then I will do a
Okay, okay,
shortened version of your answer. Yes, so please.
no
Ты
worries.
паузу делай, если что, Вань.
Да, я заметки пишу, я потом целиком переведу.
Мгм.
Мгм. Yes, please.
So that's the sort of the first stage, I think. And then by the time I was in senior school, yeah, um, I knew I liked writing stories. I knew I liked doing stories for other people. I discovered role playing games in this time, so I was running adventures and campaigns for mainly Dungeons and Dragons, um, Traveller, some of the other sort of this was the 1980s, so those were the two big games that we had access to. And at this point, I suppose when we're talking about choosing or starting to work towards becoming a writer, it will be the last 2 years. If there was a point, it will be the last 2 years of my senior schooling, because what happened then was that the school library subscribed to an American magazine called the Writer's Digest.
Mhm.
And up until I started looking at this, I had never really sort of connected what I was doing with actual professional writing books that were going to be published for readers. I mean, obviously, I knew that there were people who wrote the books that I liked to read. I knew that was where they came from, but I never connected myself with that process. It was like sort of watching astronauts on television. There's just such a huge gap between where you are and what they're doing that you don't really, you know, make the connection. But then when I started reading this magazine, it was fantastic. It was all these sorts of things. There was creative writing advice, and how to um, how to develop ideas, how to structure stories. There was advice about the craft, sort of how to streamline your prose, how to edit yourself, all that kind of thing. But there was also what I hadn't encountered before and hadn't thought about was all of this sort of professional advice and industry advice, and talking about, okay, here's how you prepare a cover letter for an editor, or here's what the editors at the top 5 publishing houses are looking for this summer. Here's how to deal with rewrites. Here's how to here's how to budget and how to most of the stuff about finances and tax, so on, was aimed at Americans. So, but nevertheless, it was just talking about writing as a thing that people could do. It wasn't this sort of mystical thing that I had no idea how to connect with. And I started to think, wow, all these people are doing this stuff. This is something that I could do as well. This is there's a craft and a trade here that I can learn. And I read every issue of that magazine cover to cover. For those 2 years and since, because apparently I was the only person who was reading it when I finished school at the end of the following year. They actually said, look, do you want to take those, because you're the only person who ever reads them, and we're not going to continue the subscription. So I got to take them home with me and keep reading. And that was what opened up this whole new perspective on writing. It didn't just have to be this this thing I did mostly in the classroom, or sort of wrote in the back of exercise books and maybe showed to a friend or two. It was something. This sort of showed me how I could take that thing further. So from there, I went on to university. I still did a little bit of fiction writing. I wrote a column for the university paper, sort of a humor column, which was not terribly good. And then, tried to, after I finished and got a job that would keep me fed and keep the lights on, I started to try and get serious about writing things that I could actually send out and get published.
Mm-hmm. Oh. So that is a long story short. So did you take those magazines from the library? Did you take
Yes.
those?
Yes. They offered them to me. Like I say, they said, "Look, we need the shelf space. I should have brought one down. They're still in the house somewhere. I'm not sure where. I could have held it up for the camera. But yes, no, I still have them.
So, in terms of your Warhammer fiction, what are the main sources of inspiration when it comes to like other media, be it books, movies, etc.? So, like, what stories, I would say in any format, kind of influenced your Warhammer fiction?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I think I mean my answer to questions about influences and so on, and I suppose this is a little bit glib, is that a writer or a creative person's influence is everything they've ever seen or heard or read, because it all goes into the chemical pool in the back of your head. And crystallizes into ideas. Let's see. I mean, my second answer, and again, this might also sound a little bit glib, is that the next big influence is the setting itself, because I can remember the feeling when I first really started reading the Warhammer 40,000 um, background material. This was before there was really certainly before there was a Black Library. This was in about the mid 1990s, so there had been some novels come out which I hadn't come across and didn't have access to. But I remember I went halves in a set with the boxed set of the second edition of the game, along with the John Blanche Blood Angels and Orcs on the cover. And we went to a restaurant after we'd bought the thing and pulled the box open at the table and started going through all the books, and just that wonderful sensation when you come across a creative thing that is not quite like anything you've run across before. The 40K setting, I'd seen bits and pieces of it in White Dwarf magazine, because we sort of got into 40K sideways. We were a friend of mine that I worked with had got me into Blood Bowl, and we started buying White Dwarf for the Blood Bowl articles, and then got more and more interested in the bits and pieces of Warhammer 40,000 stuff that we would see while we were sort of looking through the rest of the magazine. And so, yeah, the first time I did that really deep dive, I pulled out the old Codex Imperialis and just started at the first page and went through it in section by section. Completely lost track of time because it was so different and so sort of actively opposed to any other science fiction that I really knew about at the time. This sort of that sort of surreal, fantastical quality that the artwork brought out, that sort of sense of Baroque decay, the idea that sort of what you get in a lot of upbeat science fiction is that sense of progress and exploration and adventure and sort of outward expansion, going on to the future, and the way that it turned all of that back on itself, and sort of showed you what happened thousands and thousands of years after all of those things, all that progress and all of the outward expansion, everything like that, had ground to a halt and fallen on its face. So, and then sort of trying to get into the setting, because we're talking influences, trying to get into that setting and write something that properly reflected that weirdness, to see if I could capture it for myself and express it myself. That strangeness and that difference, trying to get in there and do justice to it. There's let's see. The specific work, I'm just trying to sort of take an inventory of all of the things that I may have sort of drawn on or had in mind or what have you at various stages when I've been writing. And the major thing for the Shiro Calpurnia books, and this is I think I've mentioned this in write-ups before, was a crime novel by Martin Cruz Smith called Gorky Park, which is actually set in Moscow. It's a murder mystery, and I'm aware that I'm talking here about a book about Russia or about the USSR, written by an American. So I have no idea, sort of what how the book looks to Russians. But the thing that really fascinated me about it was the way that the detectives had to. They were coming at the crime from a completely different angle to what I was used to reading in those kinds of stories. And they were coming at a thing, the whole idea of what I don't know if this is going to sound strange, but of what crime meant, what it meant to be to break the law, what it meant to be administering justice. They had to do it all in a very different sort of political system under a very different ideology, and I found that it actually created the same sense, that same sort of weird dislocation from what was familiar, and I wanted to see what of that. I wanted to explore that myself, and the the Warhammer 40,000 Imperium and the Adeptus Arbiters were a perfect vehicle to write about that, because they are superficially, they're cops or FBI or whatever else you want to use as a real world analogy, but really they're not. They've been produced. They are part of and enforce the law of a society whose ideas about right and wrong and the value and rights of an individual and the role of the state and the law and everything are completely out of phase with anything that we think of. And I was thinking, what would it be like to be an enforcer of a law like that? How different would your mindset be to what we're used to seeing in our own cop stories? And I had an Arbiter's character that I had written a couple of very small pieces about. Before Inferno magazine started, I was actually doing a little thing where I would write these little one-page stories for the campaign newsletter of the Necromunda campaign that my local Games Workshop shop was running. And a couple of those have been about an Adeptus Arbiters officer named Shira Calpurnia. And so when I decided I wanted to write something more about that, then yes, I had the character right there. I knew that Mark Gascoigne liked the name, and so I picked up a couple of the elements that I already had, and I went from there. So we kind of got away from the question of influences, didn't we?
I don't know. Like, I think that we kind of covered it. So just to kind of emphasize, the main influence in terms of like this weird dislocation feeling would be Gorky Park, right? That novel, and how the local Soviet law enforcers, how they viewed the crime differently.
That sort of that sort of gave me a path to follow, because there was this whole the reading the books gave me this whole strange feeling of this strange new universe, and then that book sort of helped to crystallize a particular way of looking at it, and thought, well, how would I go about trying to capture that, and how would I go about trying to get into the mind of somebody who lives in that sort of system and that order and believes in it, isn't a rebel or anything like that, who actually is a willing servant and a willing enforcer of it. And yeah, the Martin Cruz Smith novel sort of showed me how I might do that, and gave me the idea of, wow, if he's doing that, that's fascinating, and I wonder if I could do, taking that as a sort of a guide or a trailblazer. Maybe that's something that I can do with this other system in this other world, in science fiction. I think, speaking more generally now, stories about the law, law and justice and crime, actually make great stories to tell in otherworldly settings, in imaginary settings, because that's where all of these ideas about right and wrong and and as I say, uh, what it is right and wrong for the law to do, what it means to be a person in that system, what rights you have, what laws you're expected to obey, and why. That sort of brings all of that to the right to the sort of the bleeding edge. Really brings everything out into the open. So if you really want to see what your imaginary society looks like when it's put to the test, then yeah, crime stories are great ways to do that.
So, the next question is about your experience in Black Library in the 2000s, and just a side note, like, how did you get that? How did you get to walk with the Black Library? And also, as to talking about your experience in the 2000s. So recently, Black Library, they have launched a series called Warhammer Crime, and so how was it to be a sort of a like groundbreaker in this field? Because even though your stories are Warhammer in nature, they are like crime stories as a genre. And so how did the editing editors and your colleagues in Black Library react to your decision to like kind of write crime stories in the setting? Yeah.
Right. Well, the first you're asking first about starting how I started came to work with Black Library, right?
Yes.
So the novels that I did with them, as you say, were in the 2000s. I started doing short stories for them in the late 1990s, and so I suppose picking up from where we left off with the when we were talking about my starting to write. So they Games Workshop sort of relaunched itself into fiction publishing with that magazine, Inferno magazine. You know, it was they started off at 1995, I think. I remember there was an issue 0, so they called it, in that was in a white dwarf, and they said, "Hey, look, we're doing this new thing. It's going to be a new magazine, and it's going to have Warhammer Fantasy, as it was then, and Warhammer 40,000, and there's going to be no rules, no miniatures, no tactics articles, no battle reports. It's all just fiction and art based on the games." And I thought this was I was about to say I thought this was fantastic. Actually, the first thing I was slightly aghast, because my first thought, and I don't know if this makes much sense, was, oh no, they're starting without me, because if there was something coming along that was publishing stories and they were doing fiction publication, and it was about this thing that I already knew that I could, write stories about. As I mentioned, I'd started to write fiction pieces for my local shop for their newsletter and so on. I thought, how do I get in on this? I can't let this go on without becoming part of it, because it was something that was sort of very familiar, and it felt accessible. Even with the guidance that I was talking about from the Writer's Digest and so forth. In the days before the internet really got going, trying to be an author in Australia was really quite daunting, because the publication scene and the writing scene here was tiny, and there wasn't that really easy internet access to writing communities and markets and publishers and so forth overseas. I had to sort of piece together how I might go about submitting stories and who to and who was buying, by finding the rare newsagents or specialty shops that might carry an issue of Amazing Stories or something like that, and page through trying to find guides and addresses. So I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but the point was, when Inferno came along, this was this great big brightly lit easy path. I think, all right, I can actually do this, and I grabbed the first issue of Inferno. as soon as it arrived in the shop, and I was walking away, flipping through, and I remember seeing the thing there saying, "Yes, we are looking for new contributors. Send us your stories." Yes, this is me. And I wrote up a thing that I thought was going to be pretty good, and it was actually a Warhammer fantasy story about a sort of an apprentice necromancer who gets betrayed by a wife that he thought he had, under his control. And I was fairly happy with it. I wrote up my sort of a pitch based on that, and I sent it off, and I was thinking this, and I got back a reply, and a very encouraging one. It wasn't an acceptance. It was very encouraging, saying this looks pretty good. Can you just rework it a little? I won't go into details. I asked for a couple of changes, and I made those. Send it back on a sort of almost on impulse. I took one of the little one-page pieces I'd done for the Necromunda campaign, and it was a little self-contained one-page story. I turned it into the first scene of a longer story and wrote up a story outline, because that was what they asked for. 1 or 2 pages of prose, and then an outline of how the rest of the story went. And I sort of put one together fairly quickly and just put that in there as well. And then what came back was, well, the Warhammer fantasy one isn't really for us. With hindsight, it seemed a bit funny that they were saying we don't want this because it's too battle focused, but what I'd actually written was something very like the stories that you used to get in the old army books, that would illustrate how basically just an illustration of how a particular side looked when it went and fought a battle. There wasn't much more to it than that. So yeah, fair enough. But then they really liked the Necromunda one, and then that went through a couple more rewrites. But that turned into my first professional publication with Inferno magazine. That was in about 97, 98, I think. And then once I'd signed on and I was corresponding with them, then there was sort of that pathway to put in further story submissions, and the next one was a Warhammer 40,000 one about a word bearer chaplain that they really liked, and then that sort of it just sort of accelerated from there. And then the Shira Calpurnia, the first Shira Calpurnia story to hit print, was originally meant to be a Necromunda short story, because she was I started writing her as a Necromunda character. And I came up with, again, the opening scenes in the novel Crossfire, where she's sort of pushing her way through these partying nobles, was actually one of the little one pages that I did for the store. I did a write out of those. And I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I picked it up again. I started a story out of that, which was completely different to the stuff that I'd done for the newsletter, and I came up with this cool thing about how there was an assassination attempt, and she was going up against these sort of bizarre intrigues of the nobility, which seemed like a really interesting foil to set against somebody who was a real straight shooter with an extremely simple and rigid worldview, who was really not made to understand that kind of the sort of the world of politics and treachery and intrigue that she was going to have to try and make sense of. Came up with that. They liked the pitch, and again, this was for a Necromunda story. And they asked me to write a 9,000 word story for Inferno. And for some reason, with that one, it really didn't want to be a short story. Every time I would write a scene, it would end up being longer. every time I looked at that scene, it obviously led into another scene that the story really needed before I could go on to take the story where I'd said that I would. The scenes just sort of seemed to unfold out of each other. It just kept getting bigger and bigger, and all seamlessly. There didn't seem to be any way of messing with it without actually breaking it. And I remember sending an email off to the to Christian, who was editing Inferno by that point, saying, "Okay, look, I've finished the story. I just wanted you to know that I have actually finished. I know you wanted 9,000 words. It's about 34,000 words now, but it is done. So just so you know, it's done, and I'm going to start working out how to actually bring it back down to the length that you want it." And I sent that email off and sort of sat there, sort of looking at this thing on my screen, thinking, "What the hell am I going to do with it?" And I get an email back from him saying, "Look, actually, I've got an 11-hour train trip coming up this weekend, so send me the long one because I could use something long to read." So I send it off and go back to sitting there staring at it. And about a week later, I think it was, I got a mail back, not from Inferno, but from Lindsay Priestley, who was editing their novels range at that stage, saying, "Listen, you've got this story, it's and we like it, and instead of trying to cut it down to 9,000 words, how about you write it out to 90,000 words, and that can be your first novel for us." And so that was where the novel Crossfire came from. And while we were working on it, it evolved away from... it stopped being a Necromunda story, because at that stage they were trying to have a clearer division between the Necromunda IP and the Warhammer 40,000 IP for various reasons. There was a brief conversation about actually putting it on Armageddon just before the Third War, because the Third War for Armageddon was a big deal at the time. And I didn't like that because it put a hard time limit on how many stories I could tell about Shearer's exploits in amongst the sort of the civilian politics of the Imperium, which was the angle I really wanted to take, because at some point the Orcs are going to arrive, and then it becomes it will just become another war story. So I sort of cast about, and I came up with Hydrafer as a setting, mainly because I liked the name, and I sort of read up on the references that were in there, and amended it to fit, and so that was that was how we got Crossfire. So, thinking about sort of, I guess, the second half of your question about the crime element, there was, back at this point, my memory of it is that things sort of were a lot more fluid at that time. There was a lot of room to grab absolutely any part of the setting that interested you, and pitch a story about it. There were a lot fewer of all of the factions and so forth that we have now actually had codexes and model ranges and and sort of highly developed background. There was a lot of room to move, and there was there wasn't a rigid distinction. So, for example, there was no Warhammer crime line, and there was no Warhammer horror line. There was Warhammer 40,000, and you could try telling whatever you felt like telling in that setting. So I never got any pushback against the idea of telling crime stories. And I mean, I was writing these also after Dan Abnett had already started writing the Eisenhorn books, and had, I think, I have a feeling Xenos came out while I was about halfway through Crossfire, if I'm remembering the dates correctly. And of course, Xenos is, I mean, not technically a a crime novel in the same sense that the Calpurnia ones of the Warhammer crime books are, but it had a lot of that sort of feel to it, a lot of that investigation and uncovering of mysteries articles, uncovering of mysteries angle. So it wasn't a completely new thing. I don't know. I hope I've sort of answered the question a bit there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay. So with that, Anthony will have to leave us, unfortunately. But he left a final question of his. So now with you telling the whole story of the first novel of Crossfire, he now fully understands how it came to be. But he has a question. So first of all, what was the process of expanding your 35,000 words short story into 90,000 word novel? Was like how and the second part of his question is like, so the first book was a sort of a self-contained story, whilst the second and the third, they were very much intertwined, and they seemed like a like the third one seemed like a continuation of the second one. So, and did you have any further plans for Shira? And because she, in Anthony's world, has had such a tremendous potential, and did you have any further plans to kind of expand on her character? And if you had, why didn't those plans come to be? Why didn't you? Okay, so
the process of expanding the book out. Let's see. I'm sort of casting my memory back a bit. It's the initial expansion was quite easy because, as I say, it was a story that wanted to be longer. I could tell while I was writing. You know, there always seemed to be more to say. And if I wrote a short scene in which certain events were happening, and then carrying on to another scene, I could tell that there was this great extra scene that I could write in transition that I could use for that. And then once I had the ability to then go further, and I didn't have to sort of follow the fairly narrow focus that the initial short story pitch had, and I could actually range anywhere on the planet, and I could excuse me, I could sort of show what Shira was up against in lots of different ways. I could sort of go out into the travel out into the system. I could take an altercation with another arm of the Adeptus or part of the nobility, or something that I'd have to do in a short conversation or a short action scene in a short story. I could give a whole chapter to and really sort of let it unroll, bring out lots of cool details, let the thing, like when they go out into the Hydrofer system and storm the ecclesiarchal ship, or the dueling scene at the naval gate. I could just let those whole sort of arcs within the story, let them expand and be themselves and have their own rhythm, their own beginning, middle, and end that fed back into the narrative as a whole. It's interesting sort of looking at the books next to one another, because I think in terms of which of them I like better now, Legacy, there were individual scenes in Legacy that I really like, but I think in terms of a story that actually sort of did hang together and have its rhythm like that. I think that Crossfire probably worked better as a whole book. I, as I say, it is a long time ago now. I don't know how much of this I was consciously aware of at the time, because every writer I know of says that writing that first novel, when you don't really know what you're doing, you're learning how to do it as you do it. It's always a bizarre experience. You're trying to what's that saying about jumping off the top of the cliff and building your glider on the way down? It's it's a strange experience. I don't know how much of it I was doing deliberately and how much I was sort of frantically trying to piece together as I went. I can tell you I was absolutely sick as a dog by the time I finished the book. I was stressing out. I was writing all night because I was going to work, going to the office during the day. So I was writing all night, so I wasn't sleeping, and I was eating junk food to try and sort of keep my spirits up. And so through the finishing of the book and through the rewrites, I felt like crap, but clearly I was just sort of hanging on to functioning by my fingernails, because it was on a Friday when I got the email saying, "Well done, all the edits are over, the book is at the printers, you're finished." And I basically just ended up flat on my back, sick as anything, for about 4 days. Could barely get out of bed. So I've managed to not repeat. I haven't done that to myself on any subsequent novels, luckily. So yeah, it was a strange experience, and not completely under my own conscious control, I have to say. Let's see, the next part of the question. Okay, so yes, Crossfire. Yeah, that was a very observant point, that Crossfire was a self-contained standalone book, and Legacy and Blind flowed into one another much more, because this was what they were doing, as I remember it, with a few of their authors, that they would give each person a novel, which would be initially a standalone novel, and it would just be testing the waters, say, okay, how does this person perform when they have a novel to write? And let's see how people, how the readership respond to it, and if that all seems to be positive, then we can continue and do more of them. So the first book was a standalone because, if it hadn't done well, then there may not have been any more. It did well enough that they started to refer to it as a Shira Calpurnia novel, or the first. I remember a friend sort of spotted that before I did and sort of gave me a nudge and pointed out, "Hey, do you see that? They're calling it a Shira Calpurnia novel. Like, there's going to be more of them. That's pretty cool." And then once we got talking about the next story, Crossfire hadn't been finished for long before they were saying, "Okay, what do you want the next Shira Calpurnia story to be about? Come back to us with ideas." And at that point, I thought, okay, there's an ongoing series here, if I want one. And so then I had in mind that at the finish of each book, as I was thinking, then it would sort of be a ramp for the next book to take off from. So yeah, with Legacy going into Blind, I didn't initially plan that sort of join and the opening of Blind quite the way that it was in advance. I knew that I wanted Legacy to finish with this whole, sort of horrible disaster that everything turned into with the procedures there. But then I sort of found that I'd backed myself into a bit of a corner, because the whole interesting thing about writing for that setting, and I kind of touched on this before, is that it doesn't back away from or it shouldn't back away from the sort of the full uh, grim, dark, terrible implications of what it sets up. I don't think it's playing fair with the reader or the characters, and it's not doing justice to the setting. If you set up a situation that should by rights involve something terrible happening to the characters, and then you give an easy out that means that the terrible thing doesn't come to pass. So I'd set myself up for this thing where she was, spoiler warning if anybody needs one, where Shira had presided over this not a tribunal, this ceremonial handing over the bequeathment of the Rogue Trader Charter, and it turns into a bloodbath, and the Navy has to get involved, and there's this whole sort of horrible series of altercations right across the system. That's an absolute, it's going to take, there'll be repercussions for that for months or years. Real sort of stain on the reputation of the Arbiters and everything. And if I'm going to write this setting, the Imperium and the Arbiters, as they should be written, which is this dystopian, hellish, despotic, dead bureaucracy where incompetence is considered a crime, probably a capital crime. But at the beginning of the next book, Shira hasn't had any consequences beyond maybe getting called into her boss's office and shouted at for a few minutes. That's not right. That felt really wrong. Something really, she had to be facing the full weight of the consequences of what happened. That is the way that the Imperium would work, and of course, with her personality and with the idea that I want to tell a story about somebody who is a part of the system and believes in it. Then I suppose the character note that I hit for her early on that really gave me the clarity on how to go ahead with that story was that she fully accepts and I don't know if embraces is the right word. She is determined. I mean, this is sort of in her internal monologue early in the book. She's determined to be a model prisoner. If she's going to pay the price for her crimes, then she is going to provide an example to everyone who comes after her of how an arbiter should properly, comport themselves, with their guilt as she perceives it. And so that was the sort of the character note that the character progression that led from that book into the next one. The main mystery of Blind was, it came out of some notes that I'd been doing some time before. At the time, I was keeping track of all of the little bits and pieces that I was of background and story and so forth that I was developing about Hydrofer in a card file, on the little index cards in a box, and I'd come up with the idea of this space station that housed the astropathic choir and so on, and wrote up a few lines about it and popped it in there in case I ever used it. But the first thing that went through my mind after I'd finished writing out the card and put it in its place was, that'd be a great place to set a locked room murder mystery. Because how do you effectively create a mystery in a facility that's full of people who can read minds, see into the past, who are clairvoyant? How would you do that? And so constructing the actual murder and the investigation then was a test of how could you do that, and then the process of writing Blind was bringing those two things together. I had the same problem at the end of Blind that I had at the end of legacy, which was that I'd backed myself into a corner. Because the Imperium, and Imperial law is not forgiving. There's no room for compassion. It prides itself on being vindictive and merciless. The whole point of the Imperium is that it's a distorted, hellish reflection of all of the bright, shiny, optimistic science fiction. So it's it's a setting and a system that's built on all of humanity's worst impulses. So it's going to be there's not going to be any latitude given to her for what she was able to do with solving this murder. In the final scenes, she is right back where she was at the start. She still has to face the consequences of this thing that she did. And I found that the more I thought about it, the more I found that I had got her to a place in her story that felt like a good place to come to an end. Because it's, in one way, it's open-ended. You never find out what happened to her after she was taken back to Hydrafer for her trial, and whether that was some sort of horrible, secret star chamber hearing that only 3 or 4 people ever knew the outcome of, or it might have been some kind of huge public show trial or somewhere in between. We don't know, but we had got her to the point where she herself was reconciled to what was happening, and I think the last line of dialogue I gave her was, "I'm ready to go home," and she was she completely made her peace with what was going to come next, and that seemed like a really good natural finishing point for her story, which isn't to say that I didn't think of other things that I could do. I actually had some notes for a fourth Calpurnia story at one point. I even had a title. I think it was going to be called Ashes, but I never really went and picked it back up because it felt like the trilogy had sort of, as I say, had reached a natural endpoint, and because if she's going to then go on and have more adventures, then it kind of means that all of the sort of personal anguish that she went through in Blind, with trying to come to terms with what had happened and what she had done or failed to do and what was going to happen to her, she was kind of angsting over nothing. It was really interesting. There was a very good review of it that I came across that picked up on exactly this point. And the reviewer was saying, "Look, in one way I would really like another book, but in another way I wouldn't, because for her to, well, made the same point that for her to just be back in her old job doing her old thing kind of then cuts the legs out from under a lot of the character work that she went through in Blind." So in terms of more stories about her, I don't like to say never about anything. Anything is possible, but at this point I don't have any more plans to write more stories about her. So, again, I hope that's answered the question. I'm aware that I'm sort of zigzagging and weaving around a bit. I hope I'm keeping to the topic.
Oh, I think that this is a great answer to both parts of the question. Thank you very much.